回到节目现场。上个阶段，我们谈到澳洲原住民族电视台 NITV 庆祝免费无线频道10周年，看到他们的转变，以及在主流媒体中清楚的定位。而接下来，我们要继续来问问Tanya原住民族媒体在澳洲社会扮演的角色。我们就从每一年的开始，也就是1月26号的国庆日来看。So Tanya, January 26th is the National Day of Australia. So could you please briefly introduce the origin of National Day and how Australians think about this day, because it also represents the Invasion Day and Survival Day for the Indigenous peoples?
January 26th is an abrupt way, an emotional way, a very mixed way to start the year. It represents many things to many Australians. To many, it is the official day that you celebrate the nation. It's been since 1994 the official day of celebration of Australia. However, on January 26th is also the day that marks the arrival of British colonisation into this country. So for many First Nations people, it actually marks the day of invasion. It also then represents a day of mourning, because that was the beginning of the end for our ways that were before they came. And, you know, I guess in a sense of hope, it can also be considered for many of our communities, because we've got to push forward a day of survival, that in fact we weren't wiped out as they had planned, that we are here staunch, and we always will be here. So we always was and always will be. So then how you mark that day has very many mixed feelings for our communities. And particularly in recent years, it means very mixed feelings for many Australians now. So there is a discussion that happens in Australia every year in the lead up to it is, number one, why have a national day of celebration on a day that marks invasion? I think Australia may be one of the only countries, if the only country that has its national day where one group oppresses the other. And there are a lot of more and more Australians who are concerned about that as well, like why have that day? But there are many Australians that say, look, that was the past, it's not now. And, you know, it was a part of our history, but here's a great day to actually celebrate. So it creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of, you know, but also depending on how you take this moment, for some it's also a day of empowerment, where many of our communities hit the streets to remind Australians of the injustices that still exist, and that in fact Australia is not a place that's fair, and that it has provided a safe place for everybody, and there is still inconsistencies and justices that still need to be dealt with. So for many First Nations, and I know within our media sector, we utilise this day while Australians are talking about national identity. This is a great time where we get elevated, actually, where we actually have many media outlets asking our thoughts and opinions, because our community does hit the streets. And, you know, we always have, and as I mentioned, it's also seen as a day of mourning. Before it was officially Australia Day, we were always hitting the streets on that day because it was that day. So there was always, you know, the movement of First Nations rights in this country, of inclusion, or to have access into the same freedoms that other Australians have. We've always hit the streets on this day. So it wasn't just in the last 30 years that, you know, First Nations people hit the streets. We've always made a point on this day, and we always will be. So whether it's Australia Day or not.
So from my point of view, there are still many different voices on this day, which is why Indigenous media plays an important role. I'd like to ask, what does NITV do on this day to provoke the conversation in society?
So as the Indigenous channel, you know, the channel that's for First Nations peoples in this country, it's always been really important for us to reflect our communities and our diversities of views. Considering Australia is such a huge country, it was colonized in different ways. And, you know, for many years, it was like very much a New South Wales sort of focus day, which is where the landings were. So we're keen, you know, we've always reflected. Some communities have concerts put on so that mob have a place to come and be, because there is an overwhelming sense of the majority within the community. So as a media outlet, I actually feel really empowered that we get to reflect and we get to talk and we get to amplify our issues. And that's why, as a network, we do a season leading into the day called Always Was, Always Will Be. Because if you go to any rallies around Australia with our communities, that's the chant you'll hear. You'll always hear always was, always will be Aboriginal land, because of the policies that Australia had implemented and the wars to try and annihilate, you know, assimilate First Nations peoples into the community. So we do a season called Always Was, Always Will Be, where we elevate truth-telling stories, so the best of our documentaries, the best of our movies. And then this year, on the eve of Australia Day, on the eve of January 26, we have a program called the Sunset Ceremony, so the show that represents the last sunset before they came and our world changed forever. So we delivered a 2-hour program that we broadcast live across Australia, and we did it from, you know, the backdrop was Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Opera House, a very iconic positioning that many people all over the globe know and straight away see that as Sydney. So we took over the point there, and that point, of course, is a beautiful meeting place and always has been for First Nations people, the Gadigal people, the Gadigal clan of that area. And we delivered 2 hours of conversation, art, theatre, provoking discussion and understanding about why this date is so complex. And we also ensured, you know, we could set up the agenda for the year, because of course Australians are about to vote in a referendum to have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people included in the Australian Constitution, or have a voice to Parliament. So there's the referendum for a voice to Parliament. So what does that mean when our population is about 3% of Australia's population? So the majority of Australians, many of whom have not met an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, I'd say 6 out of 10 Australians have not met one, or maybe they don't care to, and racial issues are still on the rise in this country. So cohesion is still an issue in this country. So we had a lot where, you know, we wanted to provide really thoughtful discussion that could cut through to wider Australian audiences. We had guests from other parts of Australian society, from multicultural guests, we had refugees, we had other people represented on the panels. We had, journalists talking about, what is the future for this country? What does symbolism mean? What does it mean to be an Australian? What does our identity mean? And why does it all matter? So it's a really important way for us to take carriage of the narrative, empower our communities, that we can, utilise media for its utmost. And this is the reason we exist. And we also have in our schedule, some slow TV, we have some landscape, because it can be such a hectic, noisy start of the year. So we're mindful that for some of our communities who are dealing with all degrees of different trauma, maybe they want their Indigenous media to sort of be a bit more chilled, so we try to offer that. And also we have many success stories. We have many young scientists, and, we have, First Nations people who are, Young Australians of the Year, and they're delivering and making this continent, this nation called Australia, a better nation. And we're in Canberra, we're in Parliament, so that it's a really interesting mix. We want to acknowledge our history and our truth that yet many Australians are yet to really understand. We need to ensure that Australia knows there's still injustices, and we need to correct the wrongs, and it is really important that you need to acknowledge the past, you need to heal from it, and we also need to acknowledge that in this whole 250 odd year history, we've been contributing and we've been helping this land become the nation it is today as well. So how is that recognized, and how is that narrative being looked at? And it's really important, because I think at the end of the day, as individuals, as humans, as people, there's a degree of needing a sense of belonging. And as spiritual people, our country and our place is really important. How you fit in that place, that ecosystem, and how you contribute to it and how you look after it is really important. So that's why these days like the National Day and how we all work together are really important. And that's the power of our media. And, you know, we take that with all the responsibility that we know, because if it wasn't for our ancestors and those that have gone before us, we wouldn't exist. And there's a reason why we have this media, and why we're so passionate here at NITV about it.
So for the Australia Day, NITV provide a more comprehensive perspectives to the audience in Australia through the special programs and forums. We would like to know whether there have been specific changes in Australian society.
There's definitely, look, judging by media, judging by, you know, various conversations that you hear, there's definitely a shift of understanding and consideration. There's definitely debate that does happen across social media about whether it's really an appropriate date to be celebrating the country. There's also discussion, do you need a date? Do you need to have a national day? There's, you know, so it ranges from abolish the date to conversations about let's move it to a date that makes sense for everybody, and doesn't, you know, and then you have some that say, look, at least this date we elevate the issues, and, you know, maybe the day needs to change slightly in the way it's looked at. So there is definitely a lot of change and discussion that's happening. Keeping in mind it's been Australia Day since 1994, and there was a lot of investment into schools, into systems about this idea of Australianism and ideology about what it is to be an Australian. And at that stage in 1994, it was about the blonde, blue-eyed surfing, throwing a shrimp on the Barbie sort of combos that was happening in Australian media, and how it launched as well. So there's, you know, discussions about, is this actually, and of course the campaigns have adjusted over the years, where there's more inclusion, there's celebration of the diversity of Australia. However, you know, as I mentioned, First Nations people have been hitting the streets about this day since it was long before it was Australia Day. So it's always been a day that we rise and we remember as a day of mourning. It's always been a day we remember, particularly in this region, in the New South Wales area, the Eora Nations, as a day when they first came and the shift happened. So, and for many Australians, it's been discussed in schools where before, you know, and we didn't have NITV in the past, so you didn't have media, didn't have social media. So you had, you know, media, television networks, radio stations could, you know, feed or didn't allow the conversation to occur. So it's really interesting to see the shift. And, you know, the rallying, there's been shifts in organisations and local councils who no longer celebrate or do citizenship ceremonies on Australia Day. You've got the network, Channel 10 this year, where they don't call it Australia Day, they don't acknowledge it in that way. So you have institutions, you've got a major, you know, shopping outlet, Kmart, in Australia that refused to, you know, pulled its sort of paraphernalia, the Australian flag, and what that provokes in communities. So you're having institution shifts, you're having discussions in media in a different way that never occurred before. You've actually got local councils changing the way they do the day as well. So it's a really, you know, and what's really special as this sort of free democratic country in that sense, the fact that we can do this sort of discussion, debate, without any major fear. However, it still does create and generate a lot of intensity for particularly First Nations communities, because in actual fact the business hasn't been resolved, and there needs to be a lot of corrections, and whether there ever will be enough to have to be done. But I think the main thing really that you're hearing is understanding history, understanding why, and we call that truth-telling in Australia. And until that fully is explored, and what does that look like? That looks like how schools are teaching First Nations or their history, how they're teaching about the Australian wars, the frontier wars that actually happened. All that narrative was not included in school curricula. So that is still yet to, some schools do more now, but it's not blanket, a blanket sort of teachings yet. So we still have a long way to go, but a long way to answer your question. There is a discussion, there is a definite shift in the air about, is this the right thing to do, and what is the right thing to do?
In fact, the Indigenous people have different demands on every National Day. Especially in the second half of this year, there's a referendum about Indigenous voice to Parliament. From the perspective of the media, what do you think of these demands, and what Indigenous peoples really want to achieve?
Australia is made up of 300 odd different First Nations, and we've been colonised in different ways or impacted through wars, as in the frontier wars, had removals and policies inflicted on different groups. So there are, we're not one homogenous group, and we have different ways of thinking what is the appropriate way for our communities, and that's also reflected into questions of, should there be a voice into Parliament, into the way that Australia currently legislates every citizen. And then you have discussions over, well, we're sovereign people, and then you'll have discussions, well, that's not ceding sovereignty. We never ceded sovereignty, and what happens in Canberra is not a reflection of the sovereignty. What it is a systematic change into way First Nations policies and funding is looked at. So, of course, there is debate, and there's also concern about whether there should be treaty before a voice. And then what does treaty look like? Because, of course, there's treaties are rolling out across different state jurisdictions in Australia. So you have, the state system, because we have, the federal government tier, you also have your state government, and then you also have your local council government as well in Australia. So treaties are happening, as I mentioned earlier. Local councils are doing different things around Australia. So discussions amongst our communities, there's no surprises. Trust is a massive issue, because we have in the past gone 5 steps forward, 3 steps back, or we've achieved, only in 1992 did the High Court actually acknowledge that Australia actually wasn't vacant land. So we had the Mabo decision in 1992, and then the powerful Whig people from far north Queensland pushed forward a Whig decision that changed the way native title existed on the mainland of Australia. That was a massive step forward, but there was a lot of fear-mongering in media back in the mid-90s that we were stealing backyards, and it was a very ironic campaign, but it took race relations back many years. So we once upon a time we wanted land rights, and we get land rights, but then how legislation mucks around with it, and there's wins, but there's also disputes that happen. So when we've worked and we've won, there's always been compromise and adjustments, and it's been depending on who gets into power, how that changes and how that impacts our community. So there's a lot of trust and concern about any sort of progress or any sort of attempt of change. So clarity, communication, consultation, and genuine consultation are major issues. So whether it is treaty, whether it is referendum and rights, it's how voices are heard and a part of the discussion. So, it's going to be an interesting year in front of us. I'm really glad that we're 10 years on as a free-to-air channel as NITV. I'm really excited that we do have an Indigenous network, in the sense that we can do everything in our power to ensure we've got trusted, informed, factual information out there. Because in the midst of First Nations discussions over the best way forward, you do still have a lot of Australians who, maybe don't care about First Nations people, or who are blatantly racist against First Nations people. So we have these different microcosms going on as a nation in this year, and that's why media plays a critical role in the year ahead, and it has a very responsible role to get it right in the year ahead.
As we know, WIBN has been established for 14 years now, and NITV is a founding member. What is your prospect for the future of WIBN?
I've been a part of NITV since the very beginning, since we first switched on in 2007. And then a year later, NITV was part of the formation of the World Indigenous Television Broadcast Network, WIBN, and I had the privilege of being a part of that journey. And as a young practitioner, I was a commissioner, a journalist, to be exposed at the global level to see how other Indigenous channels or networks were working, and also what was happening in their community. So straight away from the very beginning for WIBN, it was about sharing content, sharing ideas, and supporting each other in however way we could, with whatever might we could. So that still exists today. We've got our own challenges in our own backyards, but there's a lot that can be achieved with connection. And, if there's one thing the last couple of years have given us, if there is a positivity that has come out of the COVID era, has been this quick adjustment to video conferencing and team connections. And in a way, the globe has gotten quite smaller. It's a lot quicker and easier to have these international meetings. So in a way, our World Alliance has had an opportunity to realign and reshift, because prior to that, we had so many challenges because we had to sort of fight for our own existence, because we're all dealing with, digital transitions and government adjustments and, television, what is that in the modern era? So we, as our different First Nation partners in our own countries, have had to be quick, evolving, revolving entities. And there's one thing for sure, as First Nations peoples in our countries, we have an agility and a resilience like no other. So we've evolved and adjusted. So it's incredible to be reconnecting as a global network, and a strengthened approach with a new generation who are quick and see the vision in a way that maybe those previously didn't have the opportunity to see, because we're more exposed in digital and social media in a way that we weren't back in 2008. So the future is really quite exciting. Not only are we talking about this, content sharing, distribution, how we can learn from each other through languages, but this idea of connecting and being a global network can play to all of our advantages, as I guess audiences for all of us are not just within our local area. There's global interest in First Nations knowledges in a way that never existed before. Climate crisis, climate challenges, how we are looking at those who've survived the longest on this planet and their science, and how does that actually resonate with more and more global citizens. So we have something to provide, and it's really lovely to have a network that only wants to share and connect. We're beyond, it's not about the commercialization. This is about our planet and how we provide provide nourishment for our children with great storytelling, provide entertainment and connection, so that we as spirits together can deliver something pretty special. So it's really exciting to learn from each other, to connect, and to be real players in this ever exploding media planet that we're all a part of. So that's what I'm excited about for the future of the WITBIN, and what has always been the vision really from the very beginning. We just didn't know it then.
Last but not least, in Taiwan and Australia, and even the indigenous peoples in other countries, we all going through the process of transitional justice. Is there anything you want to share with us?
Yeah, for the communities, the First Nations peoples of Taiwan particularly, is to have strength with each other, support each other, and connect and communicate as much as possible. And I think that's the power of having your own media network. There's going to be 4 steps forward, 2 steps back. There's always going to be challenges, but if there's one thing I've experienced or been a part of when it comes to media or First Nations growth within my own country, is being consistent and having that agility, but also that resilience and never giving up. So there is a world of support for you, and that's something to always keep hold of. And I think, as First Nations peoples, we're connected in ways that we, I don't think we all realise how connected we are sometimes, and how much we can learn from each other, and how much we can support each other as well. So there are challenging times, but there's also lots of positive achievements that when you look back and see how far we've actually come, despite the challenges, imagine, the future really is for us to take hold of with both hands. So I would, if there's one sort of lasting sort of wish, a word is, we're here and we support each other and never give up.
So never give up, and always remember that we supporting each other on the process of transitional justice. So Tanya, thank you so much for the sharing with us today. 那刚才呢，Tanya有提到呢，原住民族媒体具备的弹性和适应力，能在快速变化的媒体产业中不断重新的定位和转换，确保呢有一个稳定的平台，持续的传递原住民族的声音。今天非常感谢观众的收看，祝您平安，再会。